When Edith Rockefeller McCormick died alone in a Chicago hotel room, she had once been the wealthiest woman in America. Yet beside her bed were not symbols of power, but a faded photograph, an ancient scarab, and secrets she had carried for over 30 years. This is not a story about money. It's a story about grief that never let go. The promise that changed everything. To understand how a woman born into unimaginable wealth could end her life haunted by memories rather than comforted by privilege, we have to go back to Cleveland, Ohio. To a kitchen table, a stack of pennies, and a little girl who believed she was destined for something greater than the world around her. Edith Rockefeller was not like her sisters. Even as a child, there was something unsettlingly intense about her, a quiet seriousness that seemed far too heavy for someone her age. While other children collected dolls and played games, Edith collected symbols, ancient coins, strange artifacts, stories from civilizations that had vanished thousands of years before she was born. Her father, John D. Rockefeller, saw intelligence in her. Her mother saw imagination. But neither realized they were watching the early formation of a mind that would spend much of its life searching for meaning in places most people never dare to look. By the age of 12, Edith could read Latin, Greek, and German. She devoured religious texts, studied history obsessively, and became fascinated by a question that would follow her for the rest of her life. What happens after death? It was an unusual obsession for a child raised in one of America's most disciplined Christian households. Yet beneath the polished image of the Rockefeller family, Edith was quietly building an inner world of her own, one filled with ancient mysteries, forgotten kingdoms, and the belief that life might be far more complicated than anyone around her understood. Years later, that private world would become her refuge. And eventually, her prison. Because while America saw Edith Rockefeller as the daughter of the richest man on earth, Edith herself was beginning to see something entirely different. Not a future wife, not a future mother, but a woman chosen for a purpose she could not yet explain. And when she met Harold McCormick in the spring of 1895, heir to another American empire, it seemed as if destiny itself had finally arrived. From the outside, it looked like a fairy tale. In reality, it was the beginning of a tragedy that would span 3 decades and leave an entire family shattered in its wake. The perfect life before the fall. In the spring of 1895, Edith Rockefeller met the man everyone believed she was destined to marry. His name was Harold Fowler McCormick. If the Rockefellers represented the future of American wealth, the McCormicks represented its industrial power. His father had invented the mechanical reaper, a machine that transformed agriculture and helped feed a growing nation. Together, the two families controlled fortunes so vast that newspapers struggled to calculate them. Their marriage was celebrated as more than a wedding. It was the union of 2 American empires. And for a while it seemed as though fate had rewarded Edith for every dream she had ever carried. The young couple settled into married life with remarkable ease. Their first years were filled with optimism, ambition, and the quiet confidence that comes from believing the future belongs to you. Then came children. One after another, they arrived like blessings. First John, then Harold Jr. Soon daughters would follow. To outsiders, Edith appeared to have achieved something almost mythical. She was young, beautiful, unimaginably wealthy, and now a mother. Photographs from the period show a woman standing at the center of a world most people could only imagine. A world of grand dinners, private rail cars, European art, and endless possibility. But wealth has a strange way of creating illusions. The larger the fortune, the easier it becomes to believe that tragedy belongs to someone else. And perhaps no family in America believed itself more protected than the Rockefellers and the McCormicks. After all, what could possibly threaten people who seemed to possess everything? Money opened every door. Influence silenced every obstacle. Power bent the world to their will. Yet hidden beneath the polished surface of Edith's perfect life was something far more fragile than anyone realized. Because happiness can sometimes be at its most dangerous just before it disappears. By the autumn of 1900, Edith was 28 years old and living what many would have called a dream. Her marriage appeared stable. Her children were healthy. Her future stretched endlessly before her. Then one morning, her young son developed a small rash beneath his ear. At first, nobody was concerned. But within days, the wealthiest family in America would discover a devastating truth. There are some doors money cannot open, and some losses that even the richest people on earth cannot survive unchanged. The day money failed. The rash appeared on a cold February morning in 1901. 3 small red spots beneath the ear of a little boy named John Rockefeller McCormick. At first, no one panicked. Children developed rashes all the time. Nannies had seen it before. Doctors had seen it before. Even Edith, despite her protective nature, believed it would pass. But by nightfall, the redness had spread. By the next morning, it had reached his chest. And when the family physician finally stepped into the room and examined the child, the atmosphere changed instantly. Scarlet fever. Today, those 2 words barely register. In 1901, they sounded like a death sentence. Within hours, one of the wealthiest households in America transformed into something else entirely. A waiting room. A place suspended between hope and terror. Telegrams were sent across the country. Specialists were summoned. Medical experts arrived by train. Every resource money could buy was placed at the bedside of a 4-year-old boy fighting for his life. Yet something strange happens when death enters a room. It doesn't care who owns the house. It doesn't care how much money sits in the bank. And it certainly doesn't care whose name appears on the family crest. For 11 days, Edith barely slept. She refused dinner invitations, ignored social obligations, turned away visitors. The world outside continued moving, but inside that bedroom, time had stopped. There was only a mother and her son. Witnesses would later recall the silence, not the silence of peace, the silence of helplessness, the kind that settles over a room when everyone understands what is happening, but nobody is willing to say it aloud. Then came March 2nd. Shortly before the afternoon faded into evening, young John opened his eyes one final time. He looked toward his mother, and according to the family's longtime nanny, spoke a single word. Mother. Hours later, he was gone. Just like that. The future that Edith had imagined, the graduations, the birthdays, the decades still waiting ahead, collapsed into a small, still body lying beneath white sheets. And while newspapers would later report the death of a Rockefeller grandson, they could never report what truly died that day. Because it wasn't only a child. Something inside Edith Rockefeller died with him. The woman who emerged from that grief would not be the same woman who entered it. In the weeks ahead, she would begin searching for answers where few people dared to look. Ancient religions, forgotten civilizations, the mysteries of death itself. And what began as mourning would slowly become an obsession, one that would reshape her marriage, her children, and the remaining 30 years of her life. The tragedy had only just begun. The beginning of the obsession. Most people believe grief fades with time, For Edith Rockefeller McCormick, grief did something far more dangerous. It evolved. After John's funeral, she disappeared from the world. Visitors arrived at the house and were turned away. Family members wrote letters that went unanswered. Even her father, John D. Rockefeller, the most powerful businessman in America, could not reach her. Behind closed doors, something was changing. When Edith finally emerged weeks later, those closest to her noticed it immediately. She looked older, not by years, but by decades. As if a part of her had traveled somewhere the living were never meant to go. Then came the first sign, a small Egyptian scarab, the same ancient symbol she had placed with her son before he was buried. To most people, it was simply an artifact. To Edith, it became a promise that death was not the end. Night after night, while Chicago slept, she buried herself in books, ancient Egyptian texts, mystical traditions, stories of souls returning in new forms. She searched desperately for evidence that love could survive the grave. But the deeper she searched, the further she drifted from the life still waiting around her. Her husband noticed. So did the servants. So did her surviving children. The woman who had once been fully present now seemed to exist in two worlds at once. One world contained her family. The other contained ghosts. And slowly, almost invisibly, the second world began winning. Then, just as Edith was struggling to hold herself together, life delivered another devastating blow. A new daughter had been born, a child carrying a version of her own name. Editha. For a brief moment, it seemed hope had returned to the McCormick household. But fate was not finished with Edith Rockefeller. Not even close. Because within a few years, another tiny coffin would leave the family estate. And this time, the questions surrounding the child's death would become even darker than the tragedy itself. The child no one talked about. For a moment, it seemed as though fate had given Edith Rockefeller McCormick a second chance. The baby girl arrived in December of 1903. She named her Editha, not simply after herself, but as if she were trying to preserve a piece of something that had already been lost. A new beginning, a new chapter, a new child to fill the silence that still echoed through the halls of the McCormick home. But grief has a way of changing how we love, and sometimes how we fear. By the summer of 1904, something unusual was happening inside the household. According to later accounts, Editha was no longer being cared for in the main residence. Instead, she was moved to a small private cottage on the family estate, a place staff members quietly referred to as the quiet house, away from visitors, away from noise, away from the rest of the family. Why no one could fully explain. Then, in August, the unimaginable happened again. Editha died. She was only 8 months old. Yet what followed was perhaps even stranger than the loss itself. The newspapers barely covered it. There were no public displays of mourning, no detailed reports, no public investigation. For a family whose every move normally filled headlines, an eerie silence suddenly descended. Almost as if the story had been buried before it could be told. And at the center of that silence stood Edith. Witnesses later described a woman drifting further away from ordinary life. She stopped speaking for long periods, ate alone, isolated herself from the surviving children who still needed their mother. It was as though the death of her son had cracked something inside her. The death of Editha shattered it completely. And in the ruins of that heartbreak, a new Edith began to emerge. One who trusted ancient symbols more than modern certainty. One who searched for answers beyond religion, beyond medicine, beyond reality itself. The tragedy was no longer something that had happened to her. It had become her identity. And soon that identity would lead her thousands of miles from home to a man whose ideas would change the course of her life forever. His name was Carl Jung. The woman who left everything behind. By 1913, Edith Rockefeller McCormick had everything most people spend their lives chasing. A famous name, a vast fortune, a magnificent estate overlooking Lake Michigan, 3 living children. And yet beneath that glittering surface she was unraveling. The deaths of John and Editha had never truly left her. They lingered like shadows in every room she entered. Every family photograph, every birthday, every quiet evening when the world expected her to move on. But Edith wasn't moving on. She was moving inward, deeper and deeper into a private universe that few people understood. Then came the decision that shocked everyone around her. At 41 years old, she boarded a ship bound for Europe. She took her children with her, and she left her husband behind. Officially, it was a temporary trip, a season of rest, a chance to recover. In reality, it would become an 8-year exile. The destination was Switzerland, and waiting there was a man whose ideas were revolutionizing the understanding of the human mind. Carl Jung. To many, Jung was a brilliant psychiatrist. To Edith, he became something far more important: a guide, a translator of grief, perhaps even the first person who could understand the strange inner world she had been building since the death of her son. Under Jung's influence, Edith began exploring dreams, symbols, archetypes, and the hidden landscapes of the unconscious mind. The questions she had carried since childhood suddenly felt alive again. Who are we beneath the roles we play? Can loss transform a person into someone entirely new? And where do the dead go when they leave us? The answers she found would change her forever. But they would also come at a terrible cost. Because while Edith was searching for meaning in Switzerland, thousands of miles away, her marriage was quietly collapsing. And soon, the distance between husband and wife would become impossible to bridge. The next chapter of Edith's life would not be defined by death. It would be defined by abandonment, and by a scandal that would make headlines across the world. The marriage that died in silence. While Edith was searching for answers in the mountains of Switzerland, another story was unfolding thousands of miles away in Chicago. And unlike the deaths that had shattered her world, this tragedy wasn't sudden. It happened slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. For years, Harold McCormick had watched his wife drift further into a reality he could neither understand nor enter. The woman he married, the ambitious young Rockefeller heiress, had become consumed by symbols, dreams, and conversations about lives that existed centuries before their own. They were no longer walking the same path. In truth, they hadn't been for years. Then Harold met someone else. Her name was Ganna Walska, a glamorous European opera singer whose talent was questioned by critics, but whose ability to command attention was undeniable. Where Edith looked inward, Ganna filled every room she entered. Where Edith searched for meaning, Ganna demanded admiration, and Harold was captivated, completely. The affair soon became one of the most talked-about scandals among America's elite. Friends whispered, newspapers speculated. Society watched as one of the nation's most powerful marriages quietly collapsed in public view. Yet perhaps the most heartbreaking part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was Edith's reaction. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public outrage, no desperate attempt to save what remained. By then, she seemed almost detached from the world of ordinary relationships, as though the marriage had ended long before anyone announced it. When the divorce was finalized in 1921, it took only hours. 26 years of marriage reduced to a stack of papers and a few signatures. An empire had fractured. A family had splintered. And Edith, now alone, stood at a crossroads. Most people would have returned home and rebuilt their lives. But Edith Rockefeller McCormick was no longer most people. The woman emerging from the ruins of her marriage was becoming something else entirely. A public figure, a spiritual seeker, and in the eyes of many Americans, a mystery bordering on madness. The years ahead would bring her fame once again. But this time it would not be for wealth. It would be for the extraordinary beliefs that would make headlines around the world. The Queen of a Forgotten Kingdom. By the early 1920s, Edith Rockefeller McCormick had become something America did not know how to understand. She was no longer simply a Rockefeller, no longer merely a wealthy divorcee. She had become a symbol, and symbols are dangerous because people rarely see the person behind them. Newspapers mocked her relentlessly. Headlines portrayed her as an eccentric heiress lost in fantasy. Reporters followed her lectures, dissected her beliefs, and laughed at her claims that dreams carried messages from deeper realms of the human soul. But beneath the ridicule was a far more complicated truth. Edith wasn't trying to escape reality. She was trying to survive it. After years of analysis with Carl Jung, she had developed a personal mythology powerful enough to hold together a life shattered by grief. She spoke openly about archetypes, ancient civilizations, and the possibility that human beings were connected across centuries through symbols and memory. To critics, it sounded absurd. To Edith, it was salvation. Yet while the public focused on her ideas, something else was happening behind the scenes. Her children were growing up, and the distance between them and their mother had become impossible to ignore. The little boy she had lost still occupied more space in her heart than the children who remained. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't neglect. It was grief frozen in time. The kind that quietly steals years without anyone noticing. Then, in 1922, another decision would place Edith and her family directly under the spotlight once again. This time, the controversy would not involve Jung, or reincarnation, or ancient Egypt. It would involve her youngest daughter, Matilda, a teenage heiress, a man more than 3 decades older than her, and a love story that would shock the entire world. For Edith Rockefeller McCormick, the storms were far from over. In many ways, they were only getting started. The Daughter Who Followed the Shadow. By 1922, Edith Rockefeller McCormick had spent more than 2 decades searching for answers to questions most people spend their lives avoiding. Why do we suffer? Why do we lose the people we love? And can a broken soul ever truly heal? But while Edith searched for meaning, her youngest daughter Matilda had spent those same years searching for something else. Stability. Silence. A place where expectations could no longer reach her. Matilda had grown up in the shadow of loss. She was born after the deaths of her brother John and her sister Editha. Long before she understood grief, she was living inside it. Then she met Max Oser, a Swiss riding instructor, a man 32 years older than her. To the outside world, the relationship looked scandalous. Newspapers exploded with headlines. Critics called him a fortune hunter. Society mocked the engagement as absurd. But the deeper tragedy may have been that nobody stopped to ask a different question. What did Matilda see in him? Perhaps she saw what had been missing for most of her life: peace. Unlike the powerful men who surrounded the Rockefeller and McCormick dynasties, Max demanded nothing from her. No public performance, no family legacy, no impossible expectations. And to a young woman raised amid emotional storms, that kind of quiet can feel like love. When the marriage was announced, Edith shocked everyone. She approved, not reluctantly, enthusiastically, as if she recognized something in her daughter that she recognized in herself. Another soul trying to escape a world that had become too heavy to carry. Yet beneath the public controversy, a darker pattern was beginning to emerge. The losses that had haunted Edith's life were no longer hers alone. They were becoming part of her children's lives as well. And in the years ahead, that pattern would reveal its final, heartbreaking cost. Because while the world debated Matilda's marriage, Edith herself was running out of time. The woman who had spent her entire life searching for meaning was about to face the one mystery she could never fully solve: her own mortality. The price of a lifetime of grief. By the early 1930s, the woman who had once stood at the center of two American dynasties was living in a very different world. The palaces were behind her. The marriage was gone. 2 children were buried, and the fortune that once seemed limitless was quietly slipping away. For decades, Edith Rockefeller McCormick had poured money into museums, opera companies, educational projects, psychological studies, and cultural institutions. To many observers, it looked like generosity. But beneath the surface, something deeper was happening. She was building monuments, not to herself, to meaning. Every donation, every lecture, every grand project was part of the same lifelong search that had begun beside her son's deathbed in 1901. A search for a reason, a pattern, a way to make suffering feel less random. Then came the diagnosis: cancer. At 59 years old, Edith found herself confronting the one reality she had spent her life trying to understand. Death was no longer a philosophical question. It was waiting for her. She moved into Suite 1801 of Chicago's Drake Hotel, overlooking the waters of Lake Michigan. Ironically, she could see the same shoreline where she had once dreamed of building a perfect life. Now there was only reflection and regret. Friends noticed that she spoke less about reincarnation and more about forgiveness, less about ancient queens and more about family. As if after decades spent searching distant horizons, she was finally turning back toward the people she had left behind. But some distances cannot be crossed in a single conversation. Some wounds outlive apologies, and as summer faded in 1932, Edith understood something that had taken her an entire lifetime to learn. The greatest losses are not always the people we bury. Sometimes they are the people still living whom we failed to see while we had the chance. And soon, in a quiet hotel room overlooking the lake, the final chapter of her extraordinary story would begin. The last things she chose to keep. On August 25, 1932, the search finally came to an end. In Suite 1801 of Chicago's Drake Hotel, Edith Rockefeller McCormick took her final breath. She was just days away from her 60th birthday. The newspapers reported the death of a Rockefeller heiress. Society remembered the eccentric patron of the arts. Critics recalled the woman who spoke of dreams, symbols, and ancient lives. But none of those identities were waiting beside her bed. What remained in that room was something far more revealing: a photograph, a scarab, and a secret. The photograph was of her son John, the little boy whose death more than 30 years earlier had altered the course of her life. Through marriages, scandals, fortunes, and continents, she had never truly left that bedside in 1901. The scarab was a symbol she had carried for decades, a reminder of rebirth memory and the belief that love might survive death. And then there was the note. A final message addressed to her brother, John Rockefeller Jr. Its contents have never been publicly revealed. Even more mysterious was the cedar trunk she had carried with her for over 3 decades. Everywhere Edith went, the trunk followed. Through Europe, through divorce, through the collapse of fortunes and the passing of years. Inside were the fragments of a life no one else was allowed to enter. Photographs, letters, ancient artifacts, memories. She requested that it remain unopened, and when she died, that wish was honored. The trunk was buried with her, sealed forever beneath the earth. Perhaps that is the most revealing detail of all. After a lifetime spent searching for answers, Edith left behind one final mystery. Not because she wanted the world to solve it, but because some griefs are so personal they can never be translated into words. Yet Edith's story did not end in that hotel room. The shadows she carried would continue into the lives of the children she left behind, and their fates would reveal the true cost of a sorrow that had lasted an entire lifetime. The children she could not save. Edith Rockefeller McCormick's story did not end with her death. In many ways, it lived on through the children she left behind. Fowler withdrew from public life. Muriel struggled with depression for years, and Mathilde, perhaps the child who understood her mother best, never fully recovered from the losses that shaped her family. When Mathilde died at just 42, many saw a painful reflection of the same emotional wounds that had haunted Edith for decades. It is easy to search for someone to blame. Edith. Wealth. Grief. But the truth is more complicated. Edith was not simply an eccentric heiress or a neglectful mother. She was a woman broken by losses so profound that they changed the course of her entire life. Her tragedy was not that she stopped loving her surviving children. It was that she never found her way fully back to them. And perhaps that is the saddest lesson of all. Sometimes the people we lose are not the ones who die. They are the ones still standing beside us while we are too consumed by pain to truly see them. And decades after her death, newly discovered letters would force historians to ask a surprising question. What if the world had misunderstood Edith Rockefeller McCormick all along?